section now. And Just Beer It is really talking about this awful word, the new normal. And it's about how to really, survive and thrive and grow your brand, particularly focused on breweries, bars, and, businesses in the beer sector, including manufacturing businesses, and how to grow your brand post-COVID in this post-COVID world. And for those of you who don't know me, you can probably tell from my dulcet tones and my accent that I'm originally from New Zealand. As Charles mentioned, my background was in advertising and brand strategy in the dark side. I like to think I came to the light side, working in the beer sector. And as Charles mentioned, I run Beer Asia, which we really exist to hero Asia's best bars, breweries, and beer-related businesses. And we do all sorts of stuff in terms of publishing, content marketing, consulting, all sorts of things. So yeah, always happy to have a chat with anyone based upon your needs as well. And just for a shout out to anyone who's coming back from Brew Bangkok. Brew Bangkok was an amazing session for me. It was kind of like I was very anxious and nervous. I thought nobody would show up. So I'm glad we've got a couple of people showing up today as well. It was my first chance to really present to a larger craft beer audience. So any Bangkokers in here, anyone who was there, shout out to you guys as well. So let's get started. I wanted to kind of dive straight in, and I'm going to make sure that I'm not going to talk for too long. That's something I'm very guilty of, particularly if there's a beer in my hand. Luckily, I've just got water, so I'll try and stick to the time. Now, I just want to get everyone to kind of give a shout out to everyone, myself included, who's really sick and tired of this new normal when it comes to digital, when it comes to marketing, and when it comes to what we've been seeing in the last 12 months. One of the things I think we're all exhausted by, and we're doing it now, but there's this fatigue around live and Zoom. We spend all of our days getting zoomed out, constantly on video chat. We're trying to kind of set up Zoom backgrounds. We're trying to, it's exhausting. And for a lot of brands, particularly last year, who dived into Facebook Live, Instagram Live, and these kind of marketing tactics, it's become pretty exhausting and tiring, and really starting to lead to some diminishing returns, which is something that I've definitely struggled with, because it was something that I was really trying to push my friends and my, people that in the craft beer industry toward doing last year. I think that time is starting to pass. And one of the other things that, I think a lot of us are really sick of, and I personally am really sick of as well, is as a beer industry, but also just as anyone involved in marketing, branding, and advertising, we keep on pumping money into the world's most toxic brand, which is Facebook. And no matter what they try and rename themselves as, now they're calling themselves Meta, they can't escape the fact that they've been largely a negative force in the last couple of years for much of the world. They've done everything from manipulate elections to cause real serious strife in countries like Myanmar. And it's something that I think a lot of us are sick of, and we're looking for alternatives and ways to get beyond Facebook's monopoly, and whether that's all of different Facebook's platforms like Instagram and WhatsApp as well. Another thing that I personally have found quite strange and frustrating is we've forgotten a lot of the basics about marketing and around what attracts people to a brand, what makes brands grow, and what makes brands sell and be successful, and what makes effective marketing. We've forgotten about the real nuts and bolts of telling stories about our businesses and our products and our brand, and making those stories exciting and emotional. And we've gone down to these alleyways that maybe do get some kind of reaction, but I'm not convinced of their effectiveness. And a very famous example, if you haven't seen it, was Burger King had one of their Whoppers get rotten. They essentially let it rot for 30 days. And it's a very obvious contrast to McDonald's and all the famous experiments people do with McDonald's. And I think Burger King was hoping to show that their products are actually fresh and they rot, versus McDonald's, which, as some of you may know, if you leave a burger, it can sit out for months and still look the same. But the question is whether these kind of marketing tactics are really kind of overcomplicating what really should be a very simple and straightforward strategy for how to reach people and how to get people excited about the brand. And it definitely generated a lot of activity and a lot of conversation in the advertising space, which definitely was a good part of this. And I think lastly, one thing I think we're noticing, one thing that I definitely can see a lot of people frustrated about in our industry, but across industries, and it's that famous quote from John Wanamaker about, whether the money you're spending on advertising is wasted, or whether, half of the money is wasted, half of it's not. And the thing is, you just don't know what makes effective marketing. And I think a lot of people feel like they're just burning up money, like one of my heroes, Chow Yun-fat, doing that here, and A Bit of Tomorrow, a great Hong Kong movie if anyone's calling in from Hong Kong. So based on this frustrating situation, we were feeding money to essentially a monopoly that's destroying our society and disrupting our politics. We're pouring money into advertising channels that we don't know. It feels like we're kind of marketers, we're brand owners, we're CEOs and managing directors and brewers without a map. It's like we're lost in this jungle of marketing tactics and techniques. And so today I want to kind of look to where from here and kind of give what I think is a bit of a compass, and at least how I think about branding and marketing and advertising, and how I think that we can get better. And I think my objective here is if you can walk away with one or two new thoughts or ideas or even things to think about, I hope that makes it a successful session for you and for me as well. So one of the things that is actually a very positive development in the last decade in advertising, it's not widely been disseminated outside of the advertising world, though it's increasingly so, is a new wave of ad women and ad men who have really come in and brought this idea of marketing effectiveness to the table. And these are essentially people who bridge the world of kind of academia and education with marketing. And what they've done, this collection of authors like Les Binet, Byron Sharp, Jenny Romaniuk, these academics, they're kind of half academic, half marketers. They've brought a lot of research to the table that really lays out that building brands and building successful brands is not that complicated. It does require hard work and effort and thinking and creativity. That's without a doubt. But there are ways that you can build, and there are certain laws or certain things that they've observed around how marketing works that we can learn from as an industry. And this whole presentation is really, my very crude New Zealand understanding of their thinking. It's a mishmash of my own personal understanding of advertising over the last 15 years I've been working in the industry, and trying to distill down what people like Sharp and Romaniuk have really brought to the table. And if you haven't read these books or heard of them, I'd really encourage you to get hold of them on a Kindle. I just recently downloaded Building Distinctive Assets, and I found it really, really useful. And I really encourage you to read these texts. They're very, very helpful. How Brands Grow, the first edition particularly, is a real eye-opener for everyone I've lent it to and who's read it. So today I'm going to talk about three things, and really it's going to be about mental availability and physical and digital availability. And this is how Byron Sharp and Jenny Romaniuk and how a lot of marketers today understand how brands are built. And the reason why brands are built, why mental availability and digital and physical availability is important, is that mental availability is the idea that if a consumer, a drinker, someone in a bar is able to see your brand and recognize it. And the real focus here is on this idea that if someone can see your brand in a crowded shelf, whether it's on e-commerce or whether it's in a bar or on a tap, or whether you're a production brand, you're in a trade show like Brew and you have a stall, it's really, really important that people can recognize and think about your brand. And I'll talk about how to get mental availability in the first section. Found digitally and really focusing on digital availability. And that's really maximizing how people can find you online and offline as well, and how it makes it really easy for people to find your brand. So if they learn about your brand first through some emotional, interesting advertising, physical and digital availability connects that consumer or that drinker or that buyer, that they connect that to a sale. And that's really, really important. So I'm going to talk about mental availability first, which is going to be a bit more about creative marketing. And then digital availability is the second part. If you're here for some very specific digital tactics, you're struggling with your branding online, I would really stick around for that. But I've got some very, very specific tactical advice for you on how to improve your website, how to work with things like Grab and e-commerce as well. So stick around whether you're keen for the more marketing side or more of the digital side. So let's talk about mental availability and discuss really what it is and why it matters. So the principles of mental availability and why it's important to be available to someone when they're out shopping, when they're shopping online, shopping offline, whether they're going to a pub or a bar. Some of the principles behind it are you want to try and reach as many drinkers as you can with your communications. There's been a real big push by the thinkers I talked about before, away from the idea of loyalty and more to this idea that you shouldn't just be targeting people in the craft beer space. You should be targeting everyone who's a drinker in the category. And I'll talk about why that is in a few minutes. One thing that you should also remember is really that your advertising's task is to build and refresh the memory of your brand. And when you first look at the origin of marketing and really look at the origin of the idea of building a brand, building a marketing strategy, obviously advertising and marketing has been around for a very long time. But in the 1970s, it really became formalized around what makes a brand. And there's a lot of different, when you look at marketing and you look at PowerPoint presentations around advertising, I've been guilty of this in the past as well. They tend to have millions of frameworks around how to build a brand. But this one, developed by JWT in 1974, is probably one of the best ways to think about what makes a brand and what makes a marketing campaign and what makes a brand strategy. And it's such an interesting way of thinking about the brand. And it's not just around product and formulation, but it's thinking about the style of advertising, the kind of media where you show up, whether you're on Facebook, LinkedIn, whether you're on Google. But it's also about the makers as well. So who made the brand, whether it's the real story, whether it's a story behind a fake maker, whether it's a character, who the users are. Also associations, like things like where your beer should be drunk, where it should be consumed, what kind of accompaniments it can go with as well. And I think one of the things that you can really think about your brand is looking at this guide, and you can find it online. Just typing JWT Planning Guide and start thinking about how your brand, if you can hit all these different things in your marketing, and whether you're thinking about that. And it's really interesting because this was developed in the 70s, yet it's been largely forgotten. This way of thinking, a very clear way of thinking about brand and thinking about strategy. But fast forward, back to post-COVID world, the new normal, which we're all sick of, feeding Facebook and feeding Amazon and watching Jeff Bezos have the mother of all big midlife crises, jousting with Elon Musk about spaceships and space travel. We're really losing the plot to some degree as a civilization, at least our rich and powerful are. But one thing that these rich and powerful, guys in the midst of the midlife crises aren't forgetting about is the importance of advertising. And I was in the advertising industry when it became very fashionable, and I know it became very fashionable in a lot of industries to think that advertising was dead. The age of advertising, the age of interrupting people with ads was over. Well, if that's the case, then I don't think Facebook, Apple, Amazon, Netflix, and Google would be increasing their ad spend on platforms like Facebook, advertising on their own platforms like they have, and you can see in this graph here. And this graph here basically shows that even the powerful brands, the biggest brands in the world that you think don't need to advertise, there's often a misconception that Apple doesn't advertise, and they absolutely do. They spend, as you can see here, nearly $1 billion a year on advertising. If these guys have to advertise, we definitely need to as well. Now, one interesting thing, and one of the reasons why advertising is so important, and one of the biggest misconceptions of the way we conceive of consumers and drinkers, is we often think that our customers, the 80-20 rule, we think 20% of our customers drink 80% of our product. That basically, when you actually look at the real data around how people buy, and this goes across categories, and you can read How Brands Grow to see the specific breakdowns across categories. It's amazing how that what you actually realize is most buyers of brands are actually light buyers. And so light buyers are actually the bulk of your drinkers. And one thing that surprises a lot of people is that, and research that Byron Sharp conducted shows that most San Miguel buyers actually only buy the brand once to thrice a year. So essentially one to three times a year, most San Miguel buyers buy the brand. The bulk of San Miguel buyers, and the most beer in the Philippines that's sold by San Miguel is sold to people who only buy it one to three times a year. So actually the people who repeatedly buy brands, and that includes craft beer, and this has been shown again and again, that audience is actually really, really small and gives diminishing returns. And you should be really focusing your marketing on winning over a new generation of drinkers, getting people excited who are in the category, who maybe haven't bought your brand, maybe competitors, consumers, even people who drink Tiger and Heineken. They're really not that different. And if these people are buying San Miguel once a year, it actually gives you an opportunity to actually market to people who are buying beer and can try and convince San Miguel buyers to buy your beer once. And this applies across categories and across markets. And it's something I can talk about in the Q&A as well, but it really underlines the importance that you should not just be targeting people in the craft beer industry. You should be targeting general beer buyers with your marketing. And this is some data that really just shows you should be focusing on reaching more drinkers, not just reaching your existing customers. And this is research, and I promise I'll get the research out of the way and get into some more interesting stuff and more creative stuff in a second. But this graph really shows long-term research by Les Binet and Peter Field that show that advertising campaigns that target the whole market, not just existing customers or new customers, that target everyone in your category, in our case that means drinkers, they're significantly more effective at advertising, significantly more effective at getting a result from their advertising. And I'll power through this very quickly, but one of the things that's really emerging that's very interesting is this idea that if you look at the share of voice about your beer and about your market, so essentially how many people search for you versus your competitors, how many people talk about you on Facebook, what you'll actually start realizing is that share of voice, if you can get more people to talk about your brand and you can improve essentially your share of search, the number of people, more people to search for it, that leads to a greater share of market in the long run. I can talk about this a bit later in the Q&A. It gets quite technical, but share of search is something that's really promising. I've personally done some research around this in the beer market in Singapore and Vietnam, and I'm starting to see some really interesting data and results. But essentially, the principle here is you want to get more people searching for you. You want to get more people talking about you, and that's really the base of what the purpose of the marketing activities you should be doing around mental availability. Now, one of the last theory slides, and I promise I'll go into some really interesting creative examples from people around the region, is you should see advertising as investment. The more people that recognize your brand, the more people that see it in ads, the more advertising you do, and obviously of good quality, the more likely it is to be purchased. So a lot of people misinterpret advertising as a cost, and I think it's actually really, really important that we see it as investment. Now, one of the things people often talk about when it's asking me about advertising is, what makes a successful brand? How do brands grow? What are the elements that make brands grow? And when you look at brands like Nike, M&M's, and all the examples in here, often you realize that it's actually a lot of things. There's a palette of assets that a lot of brands have. They have things like the Nike tick. They have the distinctive bottle outline, similar to what we were talking about yesterday during the glass session. They have phrases like "I'm loving it." They have the roaring lion that MGM had in their old movies. They have the M&M's characters. And there's now actually a framework to think about all these different things and all these different assets. And it's a framework that I'd really encourage you, in an exercise I'd really encourage you to do with your brand. And essentially what these are called, they're called distinctive assets. And what you should think about your brand is, have you got a unique logo? I'm sure all of you do. But are you applying that across all of your brand assets? So if someone sees an ad, they can recognize it. One of the biggest failures I've seen in my advertising career is so many people create ads that aren't recognizable, that you can't tell the difference, that it's very, very difficult to spot. And have you got a tagline or a phrase that's consistently applied? We saw Sam yesterday talking about Dogfish and talking about how they had their own, they even tap into really beautiful poetry and tap into literature. But have you got a certain way of doing advertising? It's a particular style. And I think when you look at this way of mapping out distinctive assets, if you're able to build essentially a palette of things that you consistently use that people can remember, that create that mental availability and create the connection with people, your advertising is going to be more successful. And that includes things like typefaces and fonts. Even just doing a simple audit of your Facebook and your Instagram account and your website. Are you consistently using the correct fonts that your designers and your brand marketers have kind of set out? Are you using consistent characters, even sounds and colors and pack shapes? All these things come together to form a really rich palette of distinctive assets. And it's really, really important you apply this discipline to your brand. Now, I'm going to have a poll in a second. But I just want to give you guys a really practical example and segue from that theory into something more interesting and into really practical examples. I think one of the best brands in the region, and there are lots of great brands in the region doing a great work with consistent distinctive assets, but one of the brands that I think I've been really impressed by recently is Behemoth, which is a New Zealand craft brewer. And Behemoth, what you can see in this slide here is Behemoth have got a character, and Shirley, and he's essentially a consistent character throughout all their packaging design, throughout their advertising. They've got a bright, funny advertising style. They come up with something, kind of quite funny Kiwi names like Chur, which means thank you in New Zealand English. And their packaging design is quite consistent as well. If you look at their can designs, you can see they look consistent. It's consistent packaging. There's a consistency to the creative. And that's one of the great tricks and tactics to making a great brand and how brands grow, is consistently applying these kind of things like colors, like characters, like having humor in your brand, having a distinctive, what a lot of people call an advertising style. And Behemoth is a great example of an advertising style. And I think anyone who hasn't even seen their brand, you can immediately tell their advertising style is funny, it's colorful, it's bright. The other thing that they do is they talk a lot about current affairs in New Zealand. And so here you can see some jokes they had on the bottom left. They created a beer called Bill Gates Wants to Microchip Me. They created a beer called Fuck Yeah Science. They created one where it shows a guy with a tinfoil hat talking about a 5G frequency enhancer, or even a human hot magnet, which is based on people saying that if you get a COVID vaccine, you can start sticking magnets to yourself. And what you can see, I think, is that they've created this advertising style that ties back to each of their seasonal releases. That's really colorful. It's funny. People share it. And it goes back to all the stuff I just talked about. It's easy to recognize on a shelf. It's something that you can talk about with your friends. It's something that's really funny and current and relevant, that ties back to that goes into all those different distinctive assets, and it creates share of voice. And I think Behemoth is a really good example of a brand that you should be looking at more, and you should be looking at yourself, but also getting your marketing team and advertising team to look at it too. And before I ask a poll, which I'll be asking in one moment, and I'll be having to jump out of the slides for a sec, one of the things that's come out very, very clearly, and I really want everyone who's listening to really emphasize this when you're thinking about what kind of marketing you want to do. when you have a creative ad and ads that are focused on very creative, that kind of create an emotional response that aren't too rational, that those creative advertising can really improve the commercial impact of advertising. And Burnett and Field have found that it's by a factor of 11. So what that means is if you have a very creative fun ad like what Behemoth has, and you have a really boring staid ad about, talking about the functional benefits of your beer, chances are that the creative ad is going to significantly perform better, even amongst people who are beer geeks like myself. We're always innately drawn. We're always totally drawn to really creative advertising. So I'm going to pause for a second, and what I think we can do is quickly run one of the polls. I'm just going to activate one of the polls here. If everyone can just give me one moment. Sorry, everyone, there's a slight technical problem getting the poll set up. Just give me a second. It gives everyone a moment to breathe through my intense presentation. If the poll isn't working, then no worries. What I can actually do is ask everyone the question I was intending to ask, and I think what you can actually do is put into the chat, and we can have a quick. I'm really curious to hear. What I wanted to ask was, how many of you listening here, irrespective of whether you're a brewery or in a B2B marketing environment, one of the things I wanted to be able to ask is, have you got a dedicated marketing team? Essentially, it's a yes or no. Have you got one person or two people, or is your marketing largely done by your for instance, your admin staff? I'm really curious to hear if you've got a dedicated marketing team. And if you don't mind, basically it's a yes or no question. If you're welcome to share, if you have, oh, there we go. We managed to get the poll. We managed to get the poll going. No worries. You don't have to put it into the chat. So if everyone I'm really curious to see everyone voting now. Essentially, if you have a team or a dedicated member of your company to handle marketing, it's something that I'm trying to understand. What I'm really curious to understand as well is, of everyone listening, if you are the person in your company who drives marketing, or if you're able to rely on a team. So we're just going to have that voting running now. That's interesting. So you can see if you can see the results, what you can see here is that it's actually quite an even split. So 14 votes yes, and that includes I voted yes as well. I added a cheeky little vote in there as well, because I do have people helping me. But it's really interesting to see that around about 45% of people don't have a dedicated marketing person. I think that also underlines the importance, and it's really interesting to see that. I think that underlines the importance. It's really important, you as a business owner or as a manager, it does underline the importance of having some marketing skill sets, even having some of these theories in play, so you're able to understand that as well. So jumping back into the presentation. So what you can see here is one of the things to think about, and what talking about this, about the importance of creativity. So we've kind of talked about that theory. I want to talk about some really practical ways that you can create cut through and create more mental availability. Now, I'm not going to go too deeply into this idea of category entry points, but it's something I would really encourage you to read about. Category entry points is this new framework that's come up recently around how essentially that you can, within your category and our category, which is beer, how do we create reasons to engage someone? How can we create a why, a when, a where, a with whom moment? How can we get someone what are the motivating factors to get someone to drink a craft beer, rather than just saying, I want to drink beer because I'm a craft beer geek? How do you get people who are less enthusiastic about craft beer and less technically minded? How do you excite them and motivate them? And I'm going to go through a bunch of examples of case studies of brands that I really think can inspire you and inspire your brand to do something interesting, and the kind of things that you can do to create that mental availability I've been talking about. So, one really good example I saw from Yakima Chief recently, 4 days ago, was they created some communications around COP26, the climate summit. Now, everyone's talking about COP26. It's the headline news. I think one of the easy ways that you can create communications and create content that gets a lot of engagement, whether you're a B2B manufacturer, a hop grower, whether you're a distributor, you can think about things like common knowledge. Common knowledge, what I mean by that is what's going on right now in the world that you can talk about. Behemoth made funny beers about vaccines. Yakima Chief talked about how their own climate policies and how they're going through climate change themselves. But there are so many other moments that you can turn into an advertising moment that get people excited and create an entry point for people to know about your brand and learn about the brand. Have you got a new brewer? Is there some kind of social milestone in the market? Is there a reopening? Have you got a new retailer? Has live music resumed? Those of my friends in Singapore listening will know what I'm talking about there. Very frustrating policy, I must admit. Is there a new partnership you can celebrate? Is there a controversy? Is there a new culinary supplier? Have you got a new TikTok account? All these things are moments that you should be constantly creating marketing and communications and content around to boost that mental availability. It's not just about planning big, long marketing campaigns. Those are really important. It's also about doing things in small micro sprint campaigns that can get people engaged and excited. Now, one of the examples that I think was really, really cool was Magpie and Korea partnering with Blizzard. And one of the things that they did was, it's partnering around Diablo 2. Give me some love in the chat or in the with the likes and the smiles. If anyone here growing up, played Blizzard and Diablo games, I'm a big fan of Diablo and Diablo 2. Magpie did this partnership with the Blizzard to create a series of beers around Diablo 2. And I think that's such an amazing way of creating something that's really you can talk about and get people really thinking and talking about and really get cut through. And one of the exciting things about partnerships like this, when you've got a really unusual partnership between a brewer and a gaming company or a musician, similar to what Sam was talking about yesterday about Dogfish Head partnering with the Grateful Dead, partnering with artists, doing these kind of exciting partnerships. I think when you create some kind of idea or do some kind of marketing, always try and work out how you can bake in public relations and bake in something that people like the Asia Brewers Network or Beer Asia, bake in something that we would think is cool to talk about and reshare, because that's free advertising and that'll get more mental availability and more people seeing it. If you can tell a really exciting, distinctive story about a new product you're making or about a new tap room or even a new project that you're launching or a new campaign. Another thing I think that's really important when you're coming up with content and thinking about advertising and marketing is really think about whatever you're doing, whether it's a piece of video content, whether you're talking about a new beer seasonal release or you're rearranging your core range or you're even launching a new brewery. How do you make it social by design? How do you make it so that people just want to share it on places like Reddit, Twitter, and LinkedIn? And what you can see here is the response to the Diablo 2 series that Magpie developed with Blizzard. There was 23 upvotes on someone saying those are fucking amazing. Too bad it's like on location only, or I would have bought these in a heartbeat. And people are saying how cool it is, how much they want it. It's creating that hype. And I think whatever you do, if you could build hype into your ideas and get that excitement built in, and a lot of breweries are doing this around the region, but really set those bars for the kind of marketing and advertising you're doing. Make it so that's something that publications can talk about, particularly outside of the beer industry, and something that people can share and get excited about as well. Another brewery that I think is doing really interesting work is Kurakura. I recently interviewed Putu from Kurakura, which is based in Bali. And one of the things they did, which I quite liked, is they've been working on a video content series, essentially a campaign that heroes their staff and their customers. And what they do is they build content that's interesting about their team, drinkers, and the community. And if you go into their YouTube channel, you type in Kurakura, they talk about Putu and Kadek, his father's relationship, about building the brewery. They interview island artisans, people doing interesting art and cultural things in Bali. They even talk about their canning line. It got hundreds of views. And it just goes to show that kind of content and marketing communications you do doesn't always have to be whiz bang complicated. It can be interesting and simple about just heroing your team and your drinkers and your community. Heart of Darkness in Vietnam during the lockdown launched a very, very aggressive campaign around selling Heart of Darkness essentials, which was providing essential goods. So not just beer and hot food, but also providing things like essential needs, like, for instance, fruit and vegetables, because it was so difficult. And by building that relationship with consumers during the lockdown, Heart of Darkness was able to partner with a range of wine distributors, bakeries, people doing all sorts of different things. And by building that partnership, one of the things I think that's a great lesson behind what Heart of Darkness did with brands like Tartine, which is a bakery, and I'm just collaborating with a local shoe designer to create custom shoes around a seasonal release. I think branding beyond your beer is a really good way, a good starting point to think about ideas that will cut through and be exciting. And what you can think about is adjacencies and new products and partnerships. I think these are all things that you can really think about in your marketing and get people excited about. Now, lastly, one of the examples I want to share, and I promise that we have about 10 minutes left, I'll be powering through this, is East West Brewing Company in Vietnam. And one of the things a lot of people have been asking me and been talking about recently is whether TikTok is a growing platform for branding, communications, and mental availability. And the data is showing that it is growing. It's still used by a pretty small number of people in Vietnam, but it's growing. And it's when these researchers ask people where they predominantly go for an application for music and entertainment, you can see TikTok's nearly there with Facebook. And one of the interesting things is you could see that, even doing a brief search on TikTok, you can see that actually East West is doing very, very well. And there's influencers talking about East West. And I don't know whether East West created this or not, but it's really, really nice. And some of these videos, there was a video about the East West's IPA, got 65,000 views. Another lady went into their tap room and put some music on while she was drinking a tasting tray, and it got more than 15,000 views and likes. And I think TikTok is a really good way of thinking and wrapping up the section. How can you win over the next generation of drinkers, not just the craft beer geeks, but how can you get people and really win over the people outside of the kind of bubble that we normally talk to, and really reach that broader mental availability so you can drive more sales and ultimately be a more successful brand and really grow your brand. And I think it's really important to think about that marketing isn't just an engineering problem. It's not just about pouring money out, spending a lot of money, though that does tend to help. But if you can also be really creative and be creative within some of those parameters that I talked about, and really build that mental availability. So if someone has seen some content of yours on YouTube, on Facebook, on LinkedIn, on TikTok, they're able to remember your brand and be more likely to buy at both off trade and on trade as well. So I'm going to pause for a sec and do another quick poll. Everyone just holds on for one moment. So the first poll that we ran, the first poll we were talking about was whether you had a dedicated had a team or a dedicated member of your company handling marketing. So what we want to also talk a bit about is about media spending. So I'm actually quite curious, besides what I'm talking about, around how much people in the craft beer scene are actually spending on different channels in terms of your paid media spend. So that's paid media. You can think about it like boosts on Facebook, boosts on paid search. But I'm also keen to also understand as well about talking about people in the group in terms of what channels you're playing in as well. And I'll be talking a lot more about channels in a few moments. If you just give us one moment while we just get there we go there. So basically this question is, what's your monthly paid media marketing budget? Now, I know a lot of people in the region, a lot of breweries aren't spending much, but that's increased recently. I am genuinely curious, like, how much are you spending? And think of this like a question aggregating across Facebook, Google Ads, YouTube, that sort of thing. All right, once people have finished voting, let's have a look at those results. Okay, so let's have a look. So that's really interesting. So we've got 23 votes. And, I actually voted as well, because in terms of Beer Asia, we actually do have a paid media marketing budget, which is around about $500. We spend about maybe $250 to $500 a month. There's a few votes still coming in. That's really interesting. So it's interesting. It's evenly spread. And I think, a lot of people, I would say, looking at this, about 50% of people are spending sub 250. And in that case, what I would emphasize really is, if you're spending, I wouldn't encourage everyone to try and, spend. It is a pain on platforms like Facebook to get reach. Even if you've got great content, sometimes you need to spend a bit of money. But I do encourage you to try and look at as well for your paid media spending. If you have got a limited budget, let's say it's, $500, try and explore spending that budget, not just on Facebook as well, because I know that's the default platform that a lot of us spend on. I was also talking before, we don't want to enrich Mark Zuckerberg further. So I definitely think it is something that you could look at advertising on channels like YouTube, channels like Google paid search. And that's something as well I'm happy to talk about in the Q&A as well. I saw a couple of questions coming in, so thanks for those. All right, so let's move on, but that's really interesting. So thanks everyone for sharing that. I'm going to power through the last section very quickly. And this is going to be a if you're interested in anything to do with digital, anything to do with really getting your digital spend and getting that digital availability improved, this is the section for you. So really what you want to think about when you're talking about digital availability is, are you easy to find and buy? Have you got presence on common marketplace platforms in your market, whether that's Shopee, Lazada, or your website, your own e-com? And I think that's a really big one for B2B. If you're a B2B, if you've got a very high, let's say you're a manufacturer or you're selling, you're a hot farmer, it's really, really important to be easy to find particularly on search and LinkedIn. prominence. So your products stand out on the Google SERP. That SERP is the search engine results page. It's what you get when you go into Google or on the virtual shelf. Another thing is if you planned your ranges and your assortment to be relevant to drinkers' needs. I think these are all things to really think about when you're thinking about physical and digital availability. You know, the days of just focusing on offline distribution are long gone. Now it's really important about getting things right on channels like Lazada and Shopee and Tiki. And I think one thing that you should be really thinking about is how are you maximizing buying occasions? And when you're maximizing buying occasions and making it really easy for people to find and buy your brand, that goes back to the idea about mental availability. If people already know you and you're in as many places as possible, they're more likely to buy you. And it's a self-reinforcing cycle where if you can get people to know about you through all those kind of crazy content ideas, like what Magpie did, you know, more bread and butter tactics, like what Kurakura are doing, you can then start really maximizing those occasions. But one way I personally think about it is I think about digital platforms and digital availability, and with two cuts. I think about renting and I think about owning. And when you think about renting and owning, think about what digital platforms you really own and control versus ones that you rent. And by rent, what I mean is, you know, that question I mentioned before around spending money on platforms like Facebook to be seen, or you don't own the architecture and you're vulnerable to platform changes, or you're vulnerable to them changing policies. You definitely own your website, which is so important. You should definitely invest in your site. It's such a critical part of a 2020, 2022 marketer's inventory. Obviously, you have your tap rooms and venues. You've got self-managed e-com, mobile, and CRM. But those are the platforms you should really be investing more in because you own them. And if you can build those up over time, it may take time and it may cost money, but those are platforms a bit like owning a house. You can see value realized in the long run. Channels that you pay rent on, which means you have to pay to play or you have to pay to be successful, like social, search, offline retail, marketplaces, Google, business, super apps. These are all platforms that you need to really skillfully think about and, you know, really invest the right amount of time and take the right strategy on. So you're not wasting all your money renting when you should be owning. Now, one of the last frameworks I promised today I'll be sharing is the 60-40 rule. And this is a rule that's been shown again and again across markets. Those of you who've worked with me in the past, who've seen my presentations, know that the 60-40 rule is very simple. You should be investing about 60% of your marketing budget in brand building and long-term sales growth. And that's that. You should be investing about 40% in sales activation. And what that means is sales activation is really promoting a promotion of sale, potentially a new product. Brand building is consistent advertising, the kind of advertising I was talking about earlier that's exciting, that's differentiated, that's really different, that builds up your brand. It gets those distinctive assets I was talking about. It gets people to recognize them. And the idea is that by spending more money on brand building and establishing your brand, those sales activation, those short-term investments that you do will have more impact because that brand building is your mental availability. And that sales activation drives the physical availability and encourages people to go to the store and close that loop and really closes that loop around sales. But the question is, you know, how do you win on a crowded digital shelf? Well, I'm going to power through this and give you guys a lot of different tips and hints around how I think brands can win on these crowded digital shelves, crowded with arseholes at the bar. Now, one thing that you should definitely do is anchor your strategy on a modern, mobile-friendly website. You know, build it on a common CMS that's easy to update, something like WordPress, Squarespace, Shopify. It's really important you build on a modern CMS. It's easy to update. There's a lot of reasons why, but I can assure you, do it. Make sure you do. And if you haven't, try and transition onto a common CMS like WordPress, like Squarespace, like Shopify. That's easy to manage and that updates automatically. I think making it easy for people to buy and integrating with your e-commerce, with super apps, for instance, driving to marketplaces like Lazada, Shopee, Tiki, if you've got presence there, and which you should have and you should be all building. Another thing that you can do is connect with customer service. Is it easy for people to reach out to you from the site, not just through email, but through Messenger? And I think the last thing is it's really important to regularly update your site, you know, once a month, every couple of weeks. By doing that more regularly, you'll get improved search traffic. Google rewards sites and a lot of other search engines like Baidu, like Naver, like Daum in Korea, they reward websites that are regularly updated. So regularly updating it is good. Don't just outsource it to someone and set them to get it. Have someone constantly updating it for you. Another thing to think about is really optimizing for search. And if you search for craft beer in Singapore, you can see that thirsty.com.sg is totally dominating the paid search ads. And Google's very tricky, right? It doesn't look like it's advertising unless you can see that little ad. But you can see there, if someone searches craft beer in Singapore, you've got Thirsty, you've got American Tap Room, and alcohol delivery. They're dominating the top of that search. So spending money on Google AdWords is becoming increasingly important in our category. I'd say a year ago it didn't matter. Now I'd say it's important to be present, even spending $100 a month US. Just being present there is a good brand defense. People can see you. But what you can also do as well is set up Google Search Console, Bing Webmaster Tools, Baidu, and Daum. I would say Google My Business and Google Maps. If you haven't heard of Google My Business, go and set it up. Make sure it's set up. Ask your marketing team, get it set up for your brewery, for your venues. It's super important. And I think setting up on Foursquare, OSM, and Apple Maps is really important as well to get found and discovered. These are platforms that Foursquare still pipes into Grab. So if you've got problems with your Grab location and Grab doesn't care, Grab also uses Foursquare as one of its location map inputs, so it can help you get the correct location. They also use Apple Maps as well, and a lot of Apple users still use Apple Maps. If you're not on there, you're missing out on a lot of higher value customers. If they haven't got good directions to your location, chances are they probably won't go. Now, one thing a lot of people have been talking about recently, and this is one of the last frameworks I want to share today, is this framework called Factors. It's from an old client of mine, Shreya Subaraya. It's called, if you type in e-commerce factors framework into Google or search Shreyas, that's his name, e-commerce factors, the link's there as well. I can share it in the chat afterwards if anyone's interested. If you guys are thinking about going into Shopee, Lazada, Tiki, Redmart, Tmall, buy any of these stores, any of these marketplaces on any platform in any market, this framework gives you a structure and a strategy to get onto that platform, to any platform that's an e-commerce marketplace, and really build a successful strategy. I personally worked with Shreyas on the strategy in the Philippines and Thailand and Australia, and it works. And I'd so strongly encourage you to steal it. It's public. He's happy for it to be stolen. Search Shreyas e-commerce factors. This will save you so much time and money and make you so much more successful in e-commerce, and it's free to access as well. And there's other things to think about as well. There are all these different ways of thinking about e-commerce, but are you giving things like social proof? So one thing that people do in uncertain situations that people don't know about craft beer is they rely on recommendations. So that's working with things like influencers, like what East West did with people on TikTok. Another thing is, authority bias. If you can get someone who's a community leader or a brewer or your owner to talk about why it's, your philosophy about brewing beer or your philosophy about B2B sales or how you support your customers, that's something that can sway people to buying your brand if they see that kind of content as well. And of course, scarcity bias. One of the easiest ways of selling out on e-commerce, whether it's you on your own e-commerce on your website, whether you're doing a limited edition release, is doing scarcity bias. So for instance, do limited time, limited access, limited time discounts, all the stuff works great. One of the last things I wanted to think about is Grab and super apps like Grab and Gojek and Uber. And I think it's really, really important on these platforms that your map locations are accurate. I would encourage you to explore listing on GrabFood and GrabMart. Even if it's a limited assortment, obviously I know profitability is a big one on this, and I've worked with all sorts of people who've struggled with this over the years. It is very expensive, and they do take a big bite out of your profitability. But it's also critical if you want to be seen on Grab, and Grab is one of Southeast Asia's largest search engines. I think it's the third largest search engine in the region, and it's so important in so many consumers' lives. If you can be on there in any way, shape, or form and be more prominent. And that's one of the last things about super apps that they've been recently launching. Tiger has been doing a very aggressive advertising in Cambodia, Vietnam, and other markets to promote their beer, and Heineken as well. It is a bit expensive, but it's something you should keep an eye on in platform advertising. And there's a few different features Grab and Gojek offer to make your venue more prominent, to make your food more prominent on there as well. Again, it costs money. It is a rent platform, so don't go all in. These are rental platforms like marketplaces as well. That's why you've got to be strategic, go in with a limited budget and a specific intention to succeed on them. So that's pretty much my presentation for today. But I really wanted to share today a bit of thinking about, how brands like yours can succeed in the coming, year or two in this post-COVID landscape, and give some ideas and some structure and some case studies for how you can build more mental availability amongst current and potential customers, essentially making people remember your brand and really getting people to have those memory structures that you constantly refresh. You remind people why you exist and why to buy you, and helping you get more digital availability as well, making it easy for people to find you online. And I know that there are a lot of different ways to do both of these tasks, but I hope today's been useful in some ways. I hope you've managed to find one or two ideas or start thinking about how you can improve your own brand strategy. And I really appreciate everyone for listening, and it's a real honor to have all of you listening and watching, and it's been a real pleasure today. But look, let's move into the Q&A and move into conversations. I know we've got a couple of questions, so let's dive in.
Okay, Ollie, do you want to go just straight into questions, Ollie, or do you want me to read them out? Are you okay finding them and reading them out?
Yeah, no, I can see the Q&A. So just having a look now. So thanks everyone for asking questions. And again, anyone who's still in here, really welcome to ask about anything I've talked about. I know I talk fast and talk a lot of nonsense. So if you manage to glean anything from me, it's a good thing. So Khan asked from Spacecraft asked a great question, which is any suggestions on how to do marketing in a country that alcohol advertising is illegal, like Thailand? So Khan, that's a great question, and I've done marketing work in Thailand. I've essentially looked at it is something I've looked at in the past, and I've worked on over the years with a number of brands, including I've worked with Sapporo previously in my previous advertising agency on their Thailand strategy. So from what I understand, I know the rules are constantly changing, and it is quite complicated. But some of the other tricks and tactics you can do are using influencers as well, using things like not showing bottle designs, talking about using unbranded. I know there's a lot of these tactics and some of them work, some of them don't. But for instance, showing glasses with unclear, someone's got unclear branding on the glass. If your branding's on the glass, but there's no alcohol in it, that's one way of doing it as well. Again, I'm not, don't take that as legal advice. Again, a marketing in markets like Thailand is a challenge. But what I would say is, doing things like influencer marketing, doing public relations as well, doing PR. I touched on that partnership Magpie did with Blizzard. As far as I know, that kind of activity doesn't break Thai law. Again, if you're very careful about it, doing partnerships. I think as well, talking about food, Thai food, and the added the implication that it's associated with alcohol without mentioning alcohol. So your alcohol brand page can talk about food. The other thing is, using, from what I've seen, and the last time I really looked at it in detail was about 18 months ago. And I know some of the brands like Chung were doing, where kind of they had green bottles kind of in ice. So you just saw the top of the bottle. So there are all these tricks and tactics. I would really encourage you to look at the big boys, look at the big Thai breweries and see what they're doing, that you can kind of copy them to an extent. The other thing is, if Facebook's cracking down on your ads, just make sure you're fully compliant. Make sure your Facebook pages are set so alcohol related. Make sure that you've got alcohol warnings on all your advertising as well. That tends to help get stuff through. It is. I know it's very difficult, but you've got to be really creative with things like PR and advertising of that as well. So I saw Dave. Dave, hey Dave, thanks for listening in. Dave was asking a question about marketing, versus a craft brand. So that's outsourced production versus made in house, and how important the distinction should be to a consumer. I think that it's something that it really depends on how you want your brand to be perceived. In my mind, I think that having outsourced production is fine as long as I think it's actually something to be celebrated. So Dave, I know that you're someone who does white labeling. You do white labeling beer for people, right? You partner with them. To me, if I was making a craft beer, I would actually celebrate the fact that you're involved. But obviously, I wouldn't use language like outsourcing into a consumer. What I'd say, Dave's our partner, and Dave's working together with us as a brewer. He might not be our full-time brewer, but he's someone that we've partnered with. And I think that's something that to me would be really positive, right? It's something that you can celebrate. Now, I think to a consumer, I don't think they really care too much about that. I think as long as you're honest and upfront. Now, obviously, I think some brands will say, well, we brew everything in-house, when they don't. I think when consumers find out that, that may matter, that distinction matters. So if anything, I would say if you're contract brewing and outsourcing the production of your beer, celebrate it. Like, talk about the people you're working with, make them part of your team. It goes back to what we were talking about earlier about Kurakura, right? I mean, I don't think people care about the employment status of the brewers. What they care about is they want to see a human face behind who's making it. That's not some kind of something made in a factory. Because remember, a lot of consumers don't even have no clue how beer is made. For all they know, they think it's whipped up in a microwave. So I think putting that human face to that is really important. So that's where I would say that if it is an outsourced production, I would actually treat it the same largely, and just want to treat your brewers, treat the people that you're working with and you're partnering with like they're your internal, like they're your internal team. So someone, Aki was asking, what if you're not creative? Can it be cultivated? Asking for a friend. So look, I think that's also one of the reasons I wanted to share some really outlandish examples, but also some clearer examples as well. I think just going through that list of things that I was suggesting before around looking at what other people are doing around the world and around the region, I think genius is steal, right? I think there's no great creative genius sitting behind a computer coming up with insane, crazy ideas. Everything comes from somewhere. And I would actually encourage you guys to go out and be inspired and steal ideas from other markets. Now, don't just steal it and not adapt it to tailor it to your conditions and tailor it to what you're doing. But go, back to that same question that Dave was asking. In a way, I think, not enough brands, for instance, that do outsource celebrate the people that they're working with at the outsourced production brewery. And I think that's an idea where if you can even celebrate that, that's something creative that a lot of people aren't doing, and that's something to be creative about. But Aki, I would encourage you to read, check out How Brands Grow. They give a lot of suggestions around how to be more creative. Those book suggestions, I would really encourage you to read them. They give a lot of ideas for non-creative people. I'm not creative. I'm hopelessly boring and conservative. I just have to be doing it for so long that I'm just lucky that it becomes like a third muscle to me. So Charles was asking, does NFT beer tick all your boxes about being able to share across the metaverse? So thanks for the question, Charles. I saw that Seven Bridges had done. Asia Brewers Network. We'd reported on what Seven Bridges was doing with Seven Bridges was doing this NFT beer. I think NFT is a really interesting space. I think blockchain, crypto, NFTs are something that I don't know a huge amount about. I've always been a bit skeptical, particularly about things like Bitcoin. I'm sure a lot of people in the chat have strong opinions about it, but I think NFTs are here to stay. And I think there's a lot of interesting ideas around how NFTs can be used for ownership of limited edition beers. What Seven Bridges is doing is very interesting. If you haven't seen it, just type in Seven Bridges NFT into Google. Go to Asia Brewers Network. We mentioned it on there. It's definitely something that I think more brewers are going to do in the next few months and years. And I'm sure we'll see some really creative uses of NFTs, talking about the ownership of the beer or beer artwork. I definitely think it is something meta, as Dave touched on at the Q&A as well. So we've got a couple more questions. So JV was asking, how would you start UA if you would start a brewery during COVID, this new normal? Well, I started a very, very small nano brewery, outsourcing my production. I worked with my partners, my friends at Real in Phnom Penh, and that was part of our marketing and branding, that we were working with a partner, similar to what Dave's question was asking about. I definitely think something that we were really proud of. We weren't trying to masquerade like we were these people just doing our own beer, though we were doing some of our own brewing. It was pretty much all done in Phnom Penh. One of the things I think that I learned very quickly, besides all the challenges, logistical business challenges, setting that up, what I would say is if I was to do it again, I would say it's even more important to get things like distinctive assets right. Even with Kakilung, the nano brewery we were setting up, and really a gypsy brewery, we really focused on getting very distinctive, different, creative, and advertising. And I worked with a friend who became a partner in the project. That's how important I think branding and creative is to a brewery. I think all breweries should have a senior design team, creative team, marketing team. It's so important. I think it's really important to stand out and be different. I think you can't now just assume that great product will sell. I think it's so important to be really creative, particularly now, because people are so depressed and stressed out, that having a really bright, creative, interesting, different, distinctive brand, craft beer brand, is something that will make people smile and make people more likely to buy. I think you can't just launch a really basic copycat brand from the US that just does basic pale ales and stuff anymore. I think you've really got to think about your product, think about your packaging design, think about your branding, think about your digital. It's all so important. So got one last question from Andrew at the Guam Brewery. G'day, Andrew. Thanks for tuning in. What do you think the marketing impact of myself shotgunning a beer real quick would be? Unfortunately, Andrew, I would do it just for you, but I actually haven't got any beer in the house. I drank it all yesterday. I'm going to be drinking tonight though, so let's see if I can get a couple of cans and we can do some shotgunning in the social session later on. That should be quite good fun. That should be good fun later in the session. I saw we got some likes and engagement there, so that's solid. So I mean, look, thanks everyone for the questions. I think that's some real great questions, and I'm inspired now to go do some shotgunning.